Our next panel, we had talked a little bit about disinformation in this space, and the next panel very much is tied to these challenges of disinformation. It's on can we and should we count ballots faster? And we've heard a little bit about that earlier. One of the pieces of disinformation that has become very prominent lately is the idea that it's 8:01 p.m., why don't I know who won the election already? Which it would be pretty remarkable if we could count 160 million ballots that were all multiple pages and had dozens of races on them in literally a minute. And this disinformation has gained even more prominence as we hear, for instance, candidates in, let's say, a Republican primary in Arizona complain that it's taking too long to count ballots in that primary while they are behind, and then when during the counting of those ballots, they take the lead in the primary contest. Remarkably, they go very quiet at that point in time. But this is something I know election officials are hearing more and more, as if the normal process of counting ballots is somehow nefarious. And as if there has ever been a point in American history where we snapped our fingers and counted our ballots and knew the results of every race, no matter how narrow, instantly on election night. So please welcome this panel. I'll start. Our moderator is Dianne Gallagher of CNN, who's been a wonderful reporter working on this issue and other issues related to elections. To her left is Cathy Darling Allen, who's the Registrar of Shasta County, California. That's Redding, California, if you happen to be driving north on I-5, right? Next to Cathy is Secretary of State Kyle Ardoin of Louisiana. To Kyle's left is Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanzas of Vermont. And to Sarah's left is Secretary of State Tahesha of New Jersey. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Dianne, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you all. I guess we should start with sort of just the statement of fact, which is that the United States has never had official results on election night. But there is a lot of interest, especially over the past few years, on how exactly we count ballots and when do we know results. And so the U.S. tends to take a little longer than other countries sometimes, which has exacerbated some of the conspiracies that we've seen fomenting around this. So for all of you, how long does it actually take you to count ballots? Cathy, let's start with you.
Sure. So in California, which is now an all-mail ballot state, traditionally the highest day of return for vote-by-mail ballots is Election Day itself. Mm-hmm. So especially in the last 3 elections, the results that we published by the end of the evening on election night is about half the ballots that we have to count in total. So essentially every race is too close to call on election night in California.
And California has infamously long ballots a lot.
Yes, in 2020 we had 12 propositions statewide on the ballot. In the primary in 2018, our ballot was double-sided, 19 inches long. So very long and complicated ballots.
Whew. Secretary Ardoin, Louisiana is also a little unique in the way things happen.
Well, we've gotten a little less unique, thank God, but we typically have unofficial complete results by 5 hours after the polls close. Mm-hmm. Of course, election day voting is the vast majority voting, and we still have DRE machines. Mm-hmm. But the absentee balloting program has grown since COVID and significantly. And so what we did was we passed the law to allow for 4 days prior to the elections to start processing mm-hmm. the absentee ballots on the local Board of Elections supervisors in each parish, but not counting them. We start counting on election day early in the morning until they are finished counting it that day. And typically, we only have 1 or 2 parishes that are still counting past 8 p.m. Mm-hmm. And we end up, as everybody, I mean, people want results quickly. And
yes.
As David said, 8:01 p.m. I'm getting calls at 1 second past 8. But we typically feel good about that process, and Louisianans get concerned if anything goes past midnight. And the presidential election, which we had 72% turnout, we had everything done by 12:15 a.m.
Okay. Secretary Hanzas?
So Vermont has a couple of things going in its favor, which allow us to do a pretty quick turnaround. We have official results recorded with our office within 48 hours, but most of our jurisdictions have entered their unofficial results that evening. And so the couple of things that are helping us with that quick turnaround, number one, we have very few people. It's easier to count ballots when there's only 300,000 of them. We have 247 different election jurisdictions. And so, as you can imagine, these are on the municipal level, very small communities. But we also have a few election policies that have helped us to keep that timeline short. Number one is processing absentee ballots before Election Day, not counting them or announcing any tabulation of the results, but to be able to begin feeding those through. And as with anything in election policy, we're always looking at a balance between accuracy, fairness, and what would give voters the confidence in their election procedures.
And Secretary Wei?
Thank you, Diane. I guess two principles you want to follow, of course, is election integrity, and you want to follow the rule of law set forth under your state. And for New Jersey, similar to Secretary Ardoin, with the greater number and increase of vote by mail, we call them in New Jersey, the no excuse vote by mailers, as a result of the pandemic, our state changed the law that you could process vote by mails 5 days prior to the election. So you have to factor in that. You also have to factor in, under New Jersey's law, that vote by mails, we're a postmarked state. So we can accept a postmarked vote by mail up to 6 days thereafter. And then we have instituted the cure of vote by mails. With that being said, that gives an additional amount of time for counting. I want to say 2 days prior to the local boards of canvassers to certify, you have up to that time period. Then you have your provisional voters too, which the boards count, I want to say about 7 days after the election. So when you couple all of those considerations, we have our election workers following the law and are doing this with the utmost integrity and care. I think that you hear folks say, oh, well, can you count it faster? But there's a basic premise, and again, for the government's process to work efficiently, is that's what we're looking for.
All right, highlighting from you four right here, I think we all know that the U.S. has a decentralized election process. Every state, and in some cases, different regions, different parishes do things differently based on population, laws, and equipment. But all of your answers seemingly highlighted three very large tenets, which is accuracy, the methods that you use, be it DREs, BMDs, paper, voting by mail, and the idea of pre-processing. And there's at least half a dozen states in the country that do not allow for pre-processing. And we've seen how that sort of plays out when the entire nation is watching for particular races to be called. How much has that pre-processing option for you helped expedite getting quote unquote results? Because they're all unofficial at this point, but getting those results. How much does pre-processing factor into that when we're talking about voting by mail?
Well, in Louisiana, the pre-processing has become the most efficient part of being able to count more and more absentee paper ballots. Because what it does is it requires the board to sit there. They have to determine which ballots are to be challenged, which are not, which can then be counted. If you wait until Election Day to do that, then we've lost time, and it would be days after the election, of which then people would start questioning, oh, is this parish stuff in the ballot box? Are they trying to change the count for this candidate or the other? But also, each of these days of processing are meetings that are open to the public. So candidates can have representatives, party officials, watchers, what have you. But the registrars and the parish boards are in charge of that process. My office is there to assist them. I don't think we could have timely results without that pre-processing. And I'll make this comment on behalf of my colleague from Florida. They were able to count and process ballots. They had all of their absentee ballots or mail ballots counted by the time polls had closed, and they were able to provide results very timely in the presidential election, and I believe it was around 4 or 5 million ballots. That's a tremendous amount of ballots to be counted. If you waited till election day, you would be probably weeks before you finished. And so, Florida recognized their issues from 2003, or when the Bush-Gore 2000. They realized that and they made changes. And so those of us who have seen an increase in mail balloting have noticed that we've got to have a quicker process, a more accurate process, because literally you're checking to make sure this person was legitimately sent the ballot. You're checking for all of the law requirements, Social Security, mother's maiden name, signature, and witness. And so if you waited, we wouldn't have, obviously we wouldn't have the results. So that process has proved very efficient for our state.
It does seem hard to sometimes equivocate because as it's lovely that more people are paying attention to the election processes, but there also comes sometimes a lack of education with that. And so while there are many people who are very vocal about wanting quick results because they're suspicious of delays, even though this is the normal process of going through, it seems like a delay. But they also do want additional security measures. They want exceptional accuracy, as we should all strive for. How do you square trying to get this done quickly so you don't, create any sort of semblance of something going on, but also make sure that you check the most important boxes, which is accuracy, which is security, making sure this is run the way it should be run?
I think you should look at it like you would look at a manufacturing line, right? Technically, what needs to happen, how much time do each of these steps require, how much human effort do all of these steps require, is there a way to automate any of these in order to speed the process along? And then, I would hope that you take that information to your state's legislature and say, look, these are the changes that we think we should make to the election law in order to allow us to be accurate, fair, seamless, and technically correct.
So the title of this panel is Can We and Should We Count Ballots Faster? Can we count ballots faster than we're already doing? Can we do that?
I think it's possible. I think that you've got to work with your legislature and you work with, I think, civic groups that are active in the political realm to determine how can we best do this in a very transparent way. I will tell you what Secretary Hanzas was saying. We have a yearly bill that we go through the legislature, and it's called our Omnibus Election Bill. And it is predetermined that it is not to have any controversial political legislation in it, but it is an omnibus bill to make technical changes to the election code or improvements to the election code that make it more efficient for our local election partners and us to do our job.
But haven't a lot of those basic technical changes become politicized? I know that you, Cathy, can speak to that, where you currently work in every single day that you are doing your job.
Yes. So we are facing change in how we conduct elections in Shasta County. Our Board of Supervisors, which has the authority to determine how we process ballots and how the way that we count ballots and the election systems that we use, has decided to go to hand counting. So that will dramatically change the speed with which we're able to count ballots. We will not be able to pre-process any longer. Currently under California law, we can pre-process starting right when we send ballots out, but under a hand count scenario, we can't start processing until 8 a.m. the day before. So that means that we will not have results of any kind at 8 p.m. or at 8:01. We're required to report every 2 hours on election night, and that process will start. We'll probably issue first results at 10 p.m. and then every 2 hours after that, continuously 24 hours a day until Thursday morning that week.
Not only does that obviously slow down the results, but does that make it more difficult? I can't tell you, traveling the country, how many people over the past 3 years or so have told me they want, and for a long time I've heard the hand-marked paper ballot request from some, but now I am getting into this hand-marked paper ballots, counted by hand. All of these things are methods that would slow down a process.
So California's had paper ballots and mostly hand-marked paper ballots since 2008. So it's kind of not every state doesn't have paper ballots, but California has universally paper ballots. That's one of those pieces of information that gets broadcast at a national level and gets then dribbled down kind of to localities where it may or may not make a lot of sense.
But real quick, Secretary, you were saying?
So paper ballots obviously are the gold standard because you can come back after the election and you can take a look and double check, were the results that were reported what another set of eyes gets when these ballots are reviewed again. But I have to say, hand counting actually doesn't make sense from my experience, because when I look at the regular audits that have been done in Vermont, now this is my first term, so I did observe the audit this past year, but I've looked at the results from previous years, and it is in the communities that don't have a tabulator where you tend to see the more instances of a mistake in counting being made. And I think if you think about it, you would guess that someone who's maybe been working 15, 16-hour day on election day might make a mistake when it comes time to count that evening.
I think one of the differences for us in Louisiana is we're a top-down state. So the policy is made by the legislature, and my office implements the policy changes, and then we work with the local partners, with the registrars and the clerks to implement that. We assist them in doing the training for all poll workers, but every single parish is doing the exact same process at the exact same time, and I don't want to say exact same time, but throughout the day. And so that makes it efficient, it's very transparent, and all you have to do is read the election code to understand what any of these folks are doing. But I realize that people don't want to read the election code. I mean, I don't care. I don't really like reading the election code. But the bottom line is that, those who want to think something nefarious is going on is going to believe it. They take things out of context. And I liken it to, they take various pieces of pie, coconut, lemon, chocolate, strawberry, you name it all. They put it in a pie plate and then they call it a pie. Not possible. That is not a pie. And that's not how elections are run. And I think all of us that are chief elections officers or local county elections officers, consistency is always a major part of elections. And if you're consistent, then you're going to find accuracy and you're going to find timeliness. And I think that's important. And I would be the first to say, as quickly as we're able to get election results, and I realize that we're going to be moving to a paper-based system in the near future, but if you continue the consistency and all, you use the paper to audit, as Secretary Hanzas said, to confirm the accuracy of the election. And consistent audits will help. But those who believe that the machines are nefarious, hand counting is not the answer, because hand counting is going to delay everything, and then they're going to flip the argument on all of us and create more disinformation and misinformation, in my opinion.
Do you sometimes feel, because so many of these ideas are the opposite of one another, as you just said, do you feel like you're sometimes in a position where you can't win? You want to do things quickly, you want to do things accurate, but there always seems to be something else that comes up, often from people taking small snippets of something they've seen online or something they were told by somebody, and questioning sort of how the sausage, or the pie in this case, is made, but not looking at all of the ingredients.
That's why I'm looking forward to retirement at the end of the year.
Oh, don't say it. Has it made just simply doing the job of putting on an election and getting the results that much more difficult? Secretary Way?
Yeah, I wanted to just chime in that it's become, more of the Herculean task to go out there and educate the voters, and also in partnership with your local election officials. For New Jersey, we have our counties set up, and our counties, yes, they follow our guidelines for counting, et cetera, all of the election processes, but the makeup is different. Different folk on the board, so you wrap your arms around that. Every county, you hear about one state, you want to know one state. Well, in New Jersey, one county, that's how it goes.
Yeah.
But you have to ensure 6 months, year out. I know in New Jersey, we have statewide elections every single year. And so my team and I have truly doubled down on this voter education experience. I mean, with partnerships, even outside of the elections world, we're talking about business folk, we're talking about our academics, we're talking about, faith-based organizations, that they can get all of this information, not only about deadlines, but about just the process in of itself. It may sound simple that, in New Jersey, you have 3 ways to vote, right? But it becomes a little bit more complex for some voters when we're talking about how to complete the vote by mail so that it won't get rejected, and then you have to cure it, which then lengthens the time to report the unofficial results. I just came from my 8-year-old's dance competition, okay? There's a reason for me to mention it. And the reason is because as a parent, we all know when our kids are in activities, I've had a figure skater, gymnast, et cetera, and you say, well, why did my child in the back of your mind come in second instead of first? When I get the report back of what she did and what she did not do, I'm educated and I take a step back. And so now I'm informed about the process of how all of this works. And, again, it's very key for all of us to work in partnership in our states to disseminate the right information, that accurate information on all of these processes. Folk come up to me, they're not even aware. They're like, well, why haven't the votes been counted or what have you? They have not been aware or acknowledging all of these periods in which folk can cure, okay? And then the provisional voters, they feel as though their votes aren't even going to be counted, but that's a process in of itself.
Registrar Allen, what do you do, though, when they don't believe you? When the people listening have perhaps their own ideas, your citizens have their own ideas of what's really happening. So even if you are transparent, even if the way things are changing, the methods in which people vote to acquiesce to what the people want, and they still, what do you do if they still don't believe you and there still is that distrust?
One of the things in California law that really helps us is the ability for observers to see the entire process start front to back. And so we spend a lot of time and energy making sure that we can provide that observation opportunity. Observers are just as important to us as poll workers are, as far as being a witness to the process. And so, that we have to focus on what we can do that's productive. One of my colleagues calls it the movable middle. Those are the folks we want to target and try and provide education to. In the last 3 years, we have found when people come in with questions, we generally have 2 different kinds of people who have genuine concern and want to hear what we have to say, and then people who want a confrontation. And so my response lately, in the last year or 2, has been to just try and spend as little time as possible with folks who really do not want information from me. They really want a confrontation, or they want to explain to me what they've learned from skeptics and folks who don't have a complete picture of the information of what we do actually in the building, right?
Is there a point where, and I know we've all seen this happen over the past few years, where the transparency and the accessibility does become a security threat, though, for those of you who are working in elections? We've seen people watching the counts and things get out of control, threats, people being followed home, shift workers. How do you balance that in 2023 going into 2024?
So we actually had quite a difference in 2022. We drew some pretty stringent boundaries. We did a deep dive into the observer laws in California and changed the way that we allowed observation, especially on election day and election night. We got some pushback about that, but some people are not happy about that. But I can't be expected to run elections if I can't keep staff employed because they're afraid to come to work, right? So
I saw all of you shake your head when I did that, about talking about the balance of transparency
definitely
and
a
security.
balance.
Is that something that your employees, the people who work in elections, are concerned about?
Absolutely. The poll workers are, and I think it was stated on an earlier panel, I mean, the poll workers are really the ones that are on the front line during election day or even during the 7 days of early voting. We can have security during early voting because the sites are limited. They're usually in the courthouse where the registrar is housed, or specific locations like at our state archives. And we can get security for that, but we can't get security for over almost 4,000 polling locations. But we do work with our law enforcement, our parish sheriffs. We educate them on things that we are concerned about, and for them to be ready, and they work with their local clerks on that issue. But quite frankly, when the average age of our polling workers are 65 plus, and you start losing them, there's no real sense in the younger community. And when I say younger, I'm 50 and under. There's no real guide or push for civic duty. And so I'm not really sure where we're headed with that situation, but it's going to come to a point that it's going to be urgent. And I would suspect it's the same around the country and not just in Louisiana. But working with the law enforcement, we do each federal election, the FBI comes in, our U.S. attorneys come in, and we work with them, and we do tabletop exercises and plan for the worst. But of course, they can't go into FBI can't go into a polling location, and law enforcement can't go into a polling location unless they're called by the commissioner in charge. So there are some impediments, but you got to weigh the voters' right to enter a polling location without fear of arrest and safety. So thank God we have cell phones.
And when it comes to counting, though, the transparency of counting, there are entities that use cameras to show you, so you can watch 24/7. There are people come in and can observe, glass windows. How do you approach transparency and the counting process so it doesn't slow it down or interfere or contaminate it, but also give people a view of what's going on?
Yeah, in Vermont, we have, real-time observers, and the clerks are given the ability to clearly delineate where observers can sit relative to the folks who are actually doing the counting, and that separation is important. But before that, before you get to election night, I think what I hear from local elections officials, which I take as their wisdom, is they say, slow down, be methodical with changes that you make to election law, because every time there's a change made, then we have to figure out how to describe that in a way that our voters will understand. No, this is actually the way the law works now. And, so it's part of the reason why we hired an education and civic engagement coordinator in our state, because, educating folks on what the election law is in one state is critically important for the people who live in that state. But if they're getting their news based on election law and perceived or actual violations of that in 50 other states around the country, it's going to be really hard for people to keep that straight.
I just wanted to go back to, and everything that the Secretary says is accurate. And on point, going back to just the election threats. I know in New Jersey, we don't have that level, that high level, which other states have. However, I know when I came aboard in 2018, what we were doing with our law enforcement partners is just the true focus on the cybersecurity. And of course, now, 2020 and beyond, there's still the focus of cyber, but at the same time, it's more so of the focus on our people. With that being said, our state police throughout the entire year, they monitor the internet, ensuring that there's nothing untoward being leveled against any election official. Also, at the same time, we work in partnership with our state homeland folk. Secretary Ardoin mentioned FBI, U.S. Attorney General's office, all of the good partners in developing what we have, the continuity of operation plans for our local election officials, because they're the ones on the front lines. They're the ones, if anything is going to occur and the polling locations are going to see and witness, and they need to be astute enough and timely enough to contact the right individuals to handle the situations. So the TTXs are key. Everyone now has to truly double down so that the workers, when they present themselves to us, they can be reassured, okay, that there are folk who do have their back. No, can we, stop an incident from happening, but at the same time, we can be proactive for their needs instead of reactive.
How do you approach some of these changes that happen? You've got to get prepared. I know you've got to put things into, you said, an education plan, but we've discussed things that are perceived as delays that maybe aren't delays, or maybe it's just a really close race and you've got to wait until those provisional ballots, or you've got to wait for some absentee or something of that nature. We know that in places where the electorate is, tighter, we tend to take a little longer to determine results. How do you deal in real time? If you have a delay because it's a close race, maybe something went wrong that was unexpected. Maybe a machine didn't work for that few minutes and they've kept the poll open a little longer, delays the result. How do you deal in real time if that starts to catch fire online and suddenly you're the little basis of a conspiracy that spends up? How do you do in real time your job while also soothing the public and being transparent?
I think you're touching on something that's really, those of us who do this work every day understand, that there's a lot of distractions from actually just getting the votes counted. But I think communication and getting ahead of stuff, if you know that there's a reason for a delay, do a press release, communicate with your voters as often and as carefully as you can. I think it's important to make sure that you're only saying what you know is true. And if folks want more, they may have to wait. There are delays that do happen. And at the same time, in my county, we've heard repeatedly that it's taking too long to count, and yet it has always taken this long to count. I started in elections in 2003, 20 years ago in June, and we had a 28-day canvass in California. We still have a 28-day canvass in presidential elections in California. Nothing is different from that respect. Vote by mail has dramatically increased in California up till the pandemic when we went all mail, and now we're all mail with in-person voting as well. So that does make the back end of the count take longer. Like I said, the most ballots come in on election day itself, so they all have to be processed and counted afterwards. But I think that communication piece is really the key.
I agree completely. So we have a voter hotline for throughout the day to report things. We communicate with the press throughout the day. If there's a problem going on, and someone reports it or someone picks it up from the internet, then we talk about it. And here's the normal processes that we go through. And this is not out of the norm. Something's going to occur. Well, elections are human resources driven. It's human people are doing it. I'll give an example. In a recent elections, we're always having elections in Louisiana, 4 every year, no matter what. It was a local election, and the clerk of court, in a haste to get results out of pressure, They transmitted. She realized through her process and our process that something had gone wrong. We had actually put out the right numbers, but in her internal process and her putting it out on her network, she realized she had an issue. It looked like one candidate won, the other candidate conceded, and once she reprocessed, it was just the opposite. But she got out ahead of it, and to her credit. She got information to us, and so we were able to outline to the press the processes, and she was able to call the candidates. I'll give you another example. I had just become secretary, and it was in the very election, and there was a Senate race that was within 8 votes. And one candidate went to bed thinking he had made the runoff, and the other thought he went to bed thinking he had lost. I had to pick up the phone because there was a problem at the local clerk's office in their processing, in their counting, and I had to call. I didn't want the one thinking he won, putting his head on the pillow and then waking up tomorrow, the next day saying, what happened? So I called him and I let him know, and I actually convened a meeting with all 3 candidates the next day, and we went through the process and we talked about what we were going to do, what the recount process would be, how that would work, and let their attorneys do their thing and let election administrators locally and from my office do our processes. When people understand the process and they see the consistency of the processes, then they feel comfortable. Otherwise, if they're willing to listen.
I was going to ask, do you feel like that's necessarily true right now in 20? I mean, but that's real.
Well,
what
you're going to have.
Describing, if that happened in November of last year, is everybody just like dealt with it and listened? Does that happen in 2022, 2023? Does that happen the same way, the reaction?
Here's the irony. I've been in the office for 13 years, 8 as secretary. Prior to that, first assistant. There are always going to be issues with elections. But it's so ironic that in 2024, the world came to an end for some folks, and it didn't for others. And then in the very next year, in 2021, we had another election. No one complained. And then in 2022, all of a sudden, the world was falling apart again before we ever even got to the election. And we had a smooth election. There were no problems with it. If there were any problems, it was on the very local level, which had nothing to do with the federal races. Now, we're going into a gubernatorial race and all statewide, and people are going, we want hand count, hand marked, we want you to decertify the equipment. They forget I've got to go through a procurement process. And I don't know what other states can do. I don't know if your county had to go through another procurement process, but that's not an easy thing to do. And so, I mean, people just think, people who want to find the boogeyman, you're never going to be able to tell them that the boogeyman doesn't exist. Those that are willing to listen will understand. And when you put out election policy and talk about election administration and not the politics of elections, then people are willing to understand and they are willing to move forward. And if we continue the route that we're going, there's going to be so much fatigue in this country that I'm concerned about voter participation and trusting what we as elections officers do at the county levels. If you can't trust the people who are appointed, you can unelect an elected official. Oh, you're elected too. I'm sorry.
I'm the only appointed one.
You're appointed, yeah.
It's very frustrating for us because we, as someone said earlier in the panel, we know what the truth is. We can show to the bottom line how the system works and how the election was pulled off without major errors. But people have to be willing to listen and want to understand rather than blame. And it's just, for all of us election officials in the room, that's really the hard part. And The other part of it is our policymakers, our legislators jump to conclusions by the hundreds or thousands of emails that they get that don't have any effect, and they don't come to us as election officials and ask us the right questions. They throw out legislation, and then here you are, you're in a defensive mode, and you've got to defend the system, and you've got to explain the system from a 30,000-foot level, and then sometimes they're willing to listen, sometimes they're not. I can't tell you the number of legislators I have offered to come to our office, and we will walk you through the process.
Did they take you up on it?
One. One. Out of 2 oversight committees of about 20 people. And I encourage them to go to their locals, and they don't do that.
So what can be done, either something you've experienced in your own state, in your own county, or something you would like to experience that can help, and I hate saying speed up the process, but keep the process an adequate amount to make sure that we're accurate. In journalism, we say it's better to be right than first. But you do want to be first if you can, while you're right. I imagine you want to finish this and get the count done as quickly as you accurately and securely can. How can legislators, how can your employees, your office, what can be done to achieve that?
Well, I'll just go back to the manufacturing analogy. When you see that you've got a log jam someplace, you think about what can you do to fix that. So for instance, many states have a large military and overseas populations. Vermont's population is a bit smaller, because we're small anyway, but we don't have a ton of military voters. But over the course of time, we've had a lot of them come to us and say, look, I can't get my ballot back in time. And so here's a problem, right? We are by our processes disenfranchising voters. We should look at that. We should try to figure out how to fix it. But we don't want to go the route of saying, well, we'll just take your ballot whenever it gets here, because then we know that our reporting timelines would change, and that could undermine people's confidence in our results. And so we are embarking on asking the legislature to approve an electronic ballot return so that we can receive those ballots back into their local election offices electronically to increase the likelihood that they can get their ballot in on time, but also to keep with the same reporting timelines.
Well, I think that, and we haven't done like the true postmortem on the 5-day processing yet. But of course, folk are welcoming of that idea, with the understanding that, of course, we have more lead time in processing your vote by mails. We have about 900,000 New Jersey voters who choose to vote by mail, 6.5 million who are registered. So just think about that quantitatively. But I also want to just again go back to the faith, right, for voters and those out there in our requisite states will have in the system. And this is why, we all have to try to, and we've tried to identify the major constituents who can talk to a naysayer within their space. So if there are the naysayers who are in the business arena, I'm just using that by way of example, we brought along some corporate entities who even ask me for their lunch and learns to somehow get on the phone or virtually and just go through. It may seem that it's very simple, but now you have a good portion of corporate folk who are understanding how New Jersey voters in the election process work. So, it's a lot that needs to be done in the sense of galvanizing all different groups to come aboard, because even these constituents are constituents of legislators in our state too. I know that my team and we work through bill comments, and I go before various hearings. And I do think, and again, I'm speaking about New Jersey legislatures, I do think that they welcome the education because, yes, They do get the calls, they do get the emails, and at the time, we all aren't experts in the field, so they don't understand what, if anything, is going on. So you just have to continue to make sure that everyone who is interested and genuinely interested is understanding the process. And another good thing that I know that my team and I focus upon are our youth, because if there are naysayers, and I'm coming from a good place with this, but naysayers, we all will be gone. I'm going to be gone one of these days. But we want to ingrain now those students in high school, those students in college, and pierce all of this mis and disinformation, make them understand civically and just the education of what is going on with your election process. Because when I speak with students, they genuinely want to hear the truth, and they don't want any of the politics in this. They just want to know, is your system secure? What can we do to make it a healthier democracy? This is what they're looking for too, the college students.
But a lot of those things, education programs, looking at different options for people to vote, new machines, no new machines, all of those things cost money a lot of times too. And a lot of legislation, when it comes to changing or adapting the way that we vote or adding new parameters on it, are often unfunded too. There's not a lot of extra money that's put in there. So how do you continue doing the job you're doing with this additional scrutiny, oftentimes more tasks, or in your case, totally revamping what your job is leading up to elections, and doing it on the same budget? How do you do that?
Well, I'm lucky right now. Louisiana's economy is doing fairly well, and we've got a lot of cash. And so what I'm pleased with the legislature is that they have funded many of my requests, not all. But the important thing is, for once, they've actually been setting aside large sums of money for the new voting system.
Okay.
But there's never enough money for voter education or for us to get into the schools. And so we encourage our locals to do that, but they're also strapped. And I will tell you, quite frankly, this new FOIA world is draining the resources of not just local election officials, but state election official offices as well. And I've got 2 outside law firms that help me with FOIA requests, and I have 3 attorneys and 1 paralegal. We're drowning in it, and I've got requests that probably won't be answered for 2 years because we don't have the time, we don't have the staff, and I'm being sued over it.
Yeah.
And the lawsuits are getting more and more prevalent. It's like we're settling election administration in courts rather than through policy changes at the legislative level. So elections administration is under attack from all sides, in my opinion. And the amount of money you have to pay, not to mention, I don't know about my colleagues, but I get sued just for reapportionment issues because, and I have to defend something I didn't have anything to do with. And I keep asking for more money to be able to do it. And the new world in elections, quite frankly, if I looked at it, I'd feel like we were more like governors than we were secretaries of state, because we're dealing with such a volume of issues that the offices were never ever really prepared to deal with.
I'm going to have Registrar Allen answer that question real quick, but also we're going to open it up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to ask them as Registrar Allen is continuing to answer the question about funding, basically, for you.
Yeah, funding is a really big issue. I think that my board made the change, our Board of Supervisors made the change to go to hand counting because they believe it will be less expensive. But the biggest part of our budget is always people and labor costs. And so we're very concerned about that. Meanwhile, I have the biggest union in Shasta County is striking right now over wage increases and issues around labor negotiations. So it's definitely always a challenge to find the funding. In California, elections are funded by the general fund, which also funds our law enforcement, right? So I'm never going to win a contest with public safety over funding discussions. So we really need state and federal dedicated funding to administer elections. I know real estate on the ballot is taken up by state and federal races in my county, which the county pays for, again, out of the same dollars that pay deputies. So it's definitely something that we need a nationwide answer for, not just for our county.
Absolutely.
And just if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I think they'll bring the microphone to you.
May
Sorry.
I make one other point? So Louisiana is another difference for Louisiana. We fund all elections top to bottom. Very rarely do the local governments have to put anything up. And what they do put up is very minuscule, like office space or things like that. So it's a constant drain on our state general fund. And you're fighting, like she said, you're fighting law enforcement, you're fighting Medicaid, you're fighting health services. It's a real difficult situation.
Yeah, I think we have.
Hi, I'm Melanie Sloan from American Oversight. Secretary Ardoin, there was an earlier panel that was discussing ERIC, and the panelists said that they weren't really the best people to talk about withdrawing from ERIC because they hadn't withdrawn. But Louisiana did withdraw from ERIC. Could you address some of your concerns about ERIC and why you withdrew? Thank you.
No comment.
Hi, I'm Grace Gordon with the Bipartisan Policy Center again. And my question for whoever would like to take it is, I know you all are kind of drinking from a fire hose most of the time. Are there specific research questions around pre-processing, around hand counting, around the getting faster results that the nonprofits and research institutions in the room should be addressing that would be helpful to you all in your roles?
That's a fantastic question.
It is.
I want to get her contact information because I'm sure I'll
Exactly.
think of something 5 minutes after I step off the stage.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about half a dozen states, more than half a dozen states don't allow for pre-processing. So, I mean, what should they be asking to try and get better responses, get better information, better research when it comes to these methods, these practices that you guys say have helped you speed up, if you will, the process of counting votes and maintaining accuracy?
Well, let me correct something I said earlier. In Florida, they had 45% of their mail ballots counted in time for reporting when the polls closed.
You got that text message, I know.
Yeah. But I would say this. I would say look at those states who are pre-processing and how many ballots they're pre-processing. And then what's the time frame that those votes, like for example in my state, the early votes and the absentee ballots are all reported at the same time by each parish. And then those states that do pre-process, what's their reporting time for their votes versus those states that are not? And could a pre-processing process work for those states? Especially, I would say, swing states. If they don't have it, what's the impact? If they do have it, what's the impact? I think that would be something good. And then I would suggest bringing that to NAS for a good discussion there. Because really, that's and I would really offer that you contact the executive director of NAS with 2 ex-presidents. The current president and future 2 years from now, President Steve, it would be a good project to present on, because we as secretaries and lieutenant governors that are in charge of elections, we do talk about those issues and look for ideas to improve our states and help us move forward. And I think, to me, I think that would be a bipartisan issue that we could all discuss and work on.
It sounded like pre-processing was something unanimously that you all seem to think without it tends to slow down the election result process.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you were asking the question before about paying for elections and the investment in elections, what I was thinking about is, we do a pretty good job of covering our costs on any given election year, but what we're not doing, and what I would suspect many states and jurisdictions have trouble doing, is investing in those software upgrades that they're going to need, or their hardware upgrades they're going to need over time to adopt new technologies. And so I guess what I would come back to for a suggestion is, are there software products out there that are that score well in terms of ease of use and expediting the reporting of results? And in that case, we'd love to hear about them. Do we have any other questions? For you, I have a question. You are revamping, totally different system that you're going into. What is that like? And again, California, we tend to wait longest for the results. But do you feel that this is going to deeply impact result timing to the point that the people who were encouraging this to begin with and who wanted this may also have issue with the amount of time that it's going to take to get those results?
That's entirely possible. This all started on January 24th when the Board of Supervisors canceled our voting systems contract. And so then we had to roll into procurement and find something else to serve our disabled voters when they're voting in person. So we have multiple issues to deal with as far as essentially inventing a process wholesale with the support of our Secretary of State's office, who's been great. They are working on drafting regulations for hand tally in California. I hope they are published soon. And those will go through the regular rulemaking process. And I say I hope that because part of what we have to do is present a plan to the Secretary's office and have that approved prior to the election. And so we need to get that completed and submitted. We have an election in November this year, and then we have an election in March, obviously the March presidential preference primary in California. So my really largest concern, that election in November is fairly small for us. We're 110,000 registered voters, and this election in November is about 8,500 so far. There are some other special elections kind of swirling in the background that may happen or may not on that same day. But right now we're looking at a fairly achievable thing to hand count 8,500 ballots in a timely way. But when we get to March and turnout is much, much higher, and we have many more ballots in a much more complicated ballot that I didn't say, but the special election in November will be a single contest so far, right? So that's a very simple, very easy, right? March will not be simple or easy, and that's the place where I'm very concerned that we have a success in November and then a failure in March, and that is not a place that any election official ever wants to be looking down the barrel of what may be a failed election. So we're working on procedures to try and make sure that does not happen. Obviously, that's what election officials do, right? We do contingencies and contingency plans, right, for everything. So will folks regret making this choice if election results are delayed? I can't get into someone else's head, obviously, but we're making a really good faith effort within my office. I have someone asked me a couple of weeks ago, what have you spent time on? How many hours are you spending a day working on this? And I said, basically since January 25th, I haven't done anything besides this and staff evaluations. So this is what we're doing, and the majority of my staff is doing it. in addition to FOIA. That's the other thing we can't let go.
Well, and they canceled that contract for the machine.
Correct,
due
right, and then we
distrust, correct, in the
concerns.
concerns, yes.
That was the word.
Yeah. And so we're sort of seeing this, again, this snowballing that everybody in this room has seen for the past few years now, but the implementation now of what happens when that distrust turns into policy, turns into your new way of voting, and how that's going to work out with a substantial ballot that's lengthy.
Yes.
And in a state where it already takes quite a bit of time to get those results.
Right, and remember we have a U.S. Senator who's terming out, so that contest will, if past elections bear out, we'll have probably 30 or 40 candidates in that race.
Yeah.
So to hand tabulate, now we talk about, in November of 22, for example, we had just under 69,000 people turn up and vote. And so when you're tabulating electronically, you're thinking about those pieces of paper that you're processing, right? But when you're counting by hand, you really have to think about every individual mark on the ballot. Yep. So 69,000 isn't the target, it was 2.8 million. It's a dramatic, I mean, it's just a exponential dramatic.
Yeah.
I don't even have the you see the sand? I don't even have words for some of it, but it's like a sandstorm just kind of swirling around in my brain, yeah.
We're running low on time here, so I would like to, we started it by asking, can we count ballots faster? And I want to end by asking, should we count ballots faster? Is this something that is a manufactured situation where people who have distrust in the system, whether they already did or it was, riled up by outside people who were skeptical about the situation, is the length of time it takes to get the results something that we should be concerned about? And should we do it faster? Or is that something that is just sort of this artificial creation to have something to improve, essentially?
A problem looking for a solution, or a solution looking for a problem, that's what I should say. There's a lot of kind of flip answers to this, but I think going back to kind of voter education is really what's important. California is never going to be done first because we are all mailed, and we're in the same boat with Oregon and Washington and Colorado, Nevada, Utah. So a lot of Western states.
Vermont.
And I think DC too. I think DC is also all mail now.
Yes.
So yes, good, awesome. So that way of conducting elections is not compatible with finishing at 8 o'clock on election night. That's just not going to happen, right? So folks understood how the process worked in other areas, especially for these nationwide elections. I think we'd all be better off.
Secretary?
Well, it's such an interesting question because you have Florida, who allows processing and counting as they come in. My state doesn't trust that word wouldn't get out about counting before election day, so we process. I think it's achievable. I would say this: if you have to hand count, and I'm praying for you, I want you to
Please do. Please.
You're looking for disaster, I think. There are some counties in this country that do hand count, but you look at the size and the amount of voters that they have, and it's achievable because of that. It's not necessarily achievable when you have 3 million votes cast in a presidential election with U.S. Senate or the congressional races on the same ballot. I mean, at one point we had 24 candidates for a U.S. Senate race. And you had presidential. And you have to go, we have voters that circle the donkey or the Republican, the elephant. They don't mark the candidate. So then that goes to challenge. And it's just, if you didn't have electronic scanners, I think the solution is you can get accurate results with equipment. And then you can make sure those results were accurately counted with auditing.
Yep.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the key. We have to have a paper trail.
Yeah.
We don't have to sit. How many people you think in Louisiana, we start at 6 a.m. for a presidential and we end at 8 p.m.? How do you think those 65-plus-year-olds are going to last that day and later in the night? They're gonna quit.
Yeah.
They're not going to be there. But yes, can we get accuracy and speed? It's possible, but each jurisdiction has to look at what works best for them, and that's the beauty of our system. The states know what they can do sometimes, and then the locals know what they can do even better. And I think that's how you get to accurate and speed.
Secretary, real quick, should we count ballots faster?
I can speak to my perception of Vermont, and I would say that we are on the right track because you need to balance accuracy, fairness, and speed. But at the end of the day, I think it's important that every state be thinking about how we can make sure that every legally cast ballot was counted.
Secretary White?
I was going to say that. What really matters, thank you, Secretary. What really matters is making sure that every eligible vote counts and that it's done with integrity. Yes, we want voter enhancements of our infrastructure, et cetera, but that's the major premise that I think we all are guided by.
Better to be right than to be first.
That's great. Thank you, Dianne. Thank you, panelists. This was outstanding. I'll give them a round of applause.